Hello, everybody. Welcome back for the newest session, the search for the nominal anchor. It's an honor here to be moderating this panel. I've been friends of and admirers of the work of Greg, Peter, and Bob. The search for the nominal anchor is the good title. I don't know which of the Johns came up with it, but I think the language is important. It's a search because it's as if we're on an expedition, as if the nominal anchor itself might be hiding in plain sight or missing altogether. We have a tendency when we get together groups like this to think back to some bygone era when policy was somehow perfected. That era never existed. So there is a myth of the good old days. If only we could go back to a time when we were counting money right and the conduct of monetary policy was easy, but that day didn't exist. So what we're going to try to do over the course of the next 45 minutes to an hour is do a bit of history, but with an eye towards what are the lessons learned? What can we take to make policy going forward? And I will provide for you a line from Hayek that you all know quite well. He said, if old truths are to retain their hold on men's minds, they must be restated in the language and concepts of successive generations. That's our deliverable. That's where at the end of a day like this, we want to at least sow the seeds for how we go forward. What I'm going to do is make four moderators prerogative quick statements, then first turn over to Peter to start with some history, and then we'll go to Bob and to Greg. Condi said at the outset of the discussion a couple of hours ago about the environment in which we find the broad economic policy making happening. I'd state it less diplomatically than she did. We have two hot wars and one larger Cold War. The world in a geopolitical national security sense is, as our former colleague and dearest friend George Shultz said, at a hinge point in history. So if there were ever a moment where economic policy, the conduct of monetary policy in particular, needed a stronger ballast, it would be now. To the extent we continue to make errors in the conduct of economic policy, it makes those geopolitical questions harder, the world more dangerous, not just less prosperous. So with that set, I think the goal of this conference and this panel is to start to ask the right questions, start to understand whether we have a new theoretical and empirical model, a new framework for inflation. We won't come out of this with easy answers, but at least by asking the big questions, I think we can agree potentially that the answer to this question is not looking at the latest data from the US government and rounding to 100th point about whether we're on track or off track to a 2% inflation target. Looking so far to the right of the decimal point strikes me as suggesting we are off track. We are not asking the right questions. A preoccupation with whether the next move is 0, 25, or 50. A preoccupation of the incredible staff at the Fed on forecasts of what policy will look like in 18 months' time strikes me as answering a question which is far less important than this group has been called together to do. So in some sense, my first prerogative is we need to think anew about the fundamental questions. What is inflation? What causes it? Is the central bank responsible for it or just a bystander? And how should it be measured? It is, as I said a moment ago, not obvious that we have the right empirical or theoretical framework for answering these questions, but it's high time we start doing that, especially given the policy mistakes and the inflation risks of this more recent period. In some broad sense, we have to ask the question, is America's inflation problem because Americans are earning too much and living too well? Or is it because our government is living too well, spending and printing too much? And we can try to dodge that and turn to Furbis and output gap models. But if we don't at least know that's the question, it strikes me we're not going to make huge progress. So that second point from the moderator is whether the profession and central bank policymakers are ready to think anew with the benefit of history to a new framework. Third, I grew up around this institution from the time I was a research assistant, and I have this silly idea, a bit old-fashioned, that monetary policy has something to do with money. This ought not be a dirty word in the world of central banks, but if one were to do a search of FOMC transcripts, the paucity of references to money speaks volumes about what the great and the good in the profession have to think about it. Again, if Milton were here, I think Milton would be sounding a lot like that Hayek quote I gave, not going back to what he might have said or thought 30 or 40 years ago, but thinking anew about the role of money. And fourth, and finally, before I turn it over to my panelists, absent finding a nominal anchor, absent developing a rigorous new framework, I'm afraid we're left with some puzzling contradictions. Contradictions that might be glossed over as the financial markets are at new all-time highs, but are contradictions that are likely to find their way to policymakers. I'll just note a couple of them. Is it right for a central bank to take credit for a soft landing if it does not take responsibility for the inflation surge that preceded it? Is it right for a central bank that had announced in August of 2020 a brand new framework for inflation, flexible average inflation targeting? Is it right for that never to be renounced or replaced, but just to sort of be left there as if it wasn't actually that important of a policy? And is it right to say we'll revisit that framework in a year or 18 months' time, or should that be among the first courses of business for policymakers in the US and around the world? And two more contradictions I'll raise. One, we talk about data dependence. It's a piety that we all throw around. Policymaking is data dependent. I think there are only two problems with that, the data and the dependence. But even if one were somehow to think that the data we're getting from the Bureau of Labor Statistics is a great forward indicator as to where the economy would be, it's not obvious to me that we're following data dependence if I think about the context of data over the last several months. And a fourth puzzling contradiction, a final one, which absent finding a new framework or a new nominal anchor continues to confound me at least. In the darkest days of the global financial crisis, we created quantitative easing, though by a different name at the time, because we said this is just going to be monetary policy by other means. We'd cut interest rates to zero. We had run out of other tools. We had already begun bailouts of all sorts of institutions. And we said we need monetary policy to be looser. So we started buying the bonds and mortgages of other parts of our government, other parts of financial markets. But now, as we fast forward, we think of a $7 trillion balance sheet. We say that has nothing to do with monetary policy. That has to do with excess reserves and a new regime. And again, I find it a puzzling contradiction. Either it is monetary policy or it's not. And if it is monetary policy, one problem is that monetary policy is loosening with the policy rate, but seemingly tightening with this other rate. Do we have a theoretical or empirical model of how those cancel out? Or is it only monetary policy when we want it to be? These are some of the questions, none of the answers. And for that, I'm going to turn first to our panelists to give us a bit of a history and see if we can't move forward from that. So let me introduce Peter and welcome him to the podium.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Great comments. So like Mike Bordeaux said at the beginning of today's session, the Shadow Open Market Committee was founded in the early 1970s by Karl, Brunner, and Allan Meltzer against the backdrop of high and rising inflation here in the United States. Allan would later recollect that his principal objective in forming the group was to advocate forcefully for monetary restraint as the preferred solution to the problem of inflation, preferred in particular to the wage and price controls that were much more popular at the time. The specific approach to disinflation recommended by the early SOMC involved gradually reducing the rate of money growth by 1 percentage point per year along a multi-year pre-announced path that would end once price stability had been restored. Thereafter, money growth would remain constant. So the monetary policy strategy advocated by the early Shadow Open Market Committee really had much more in common with Milton Friedman's constant money growth rule than it did with, let's say, the Taylor rule that we all know and love today. It was cast in terms of quantity variables. It made no attempt at any kind of short-run stabilization objective, let alone fine-tuning. Instead, it was directed exclusively towards restoring and then preserving long-run price stability. Friedman would famously advocate for his constant money growth rule with appeal to the long and variable lags. Brunner, Meltzer, and other early committee members would argue for their preferred approach in similar terms, often citing our lack of a reliable structural model of the American economy and the lack of the kind of timely and accurate information about the current state of the economy that would be needed to conduct a successful stabilization program. Now, in the paper that I prepared for today's session, I traced through the full details of how it was that these views gradually softened, at least somewhat over time. Part of the problem had to do with recurrent episodes of instability in the velocities of the broad monetary aggregates, M1 and M2. But for Allan Meltzer, it seems, the proverbial last straw on the back of the constant money growth rate camel came in the early 1990s because of an increase in the demand for US currency overseas, which likewise destabilized the velocity of the monetary base. So in 1993, Allan introduced a new monetary policy rule that allowed the targeted growth rate of the monetary base to adjust adaptively over time in response to shifting estimates of the long-run trend in real GDP growth and in base velocity. So the Meltzer rule continued to share something in common with the Friedman rule. Was cast in terms of quantity variables and it made no attempt at stabilization, but it was different for the obvious reason that it no longer called for constant money growth. The next episode or installment in the story came in the early 2000s when Ben McCallum joined the Shadow Open Market Committee. Not surprisingly, shortly thereafter, SOMC documents begin referring to the prescriptions of the McCallum rule. McCallum's rule is like Allan's in certain respects. It sets a target growth rate for the monetary base that adjusts adaptively to shifting estimates of the long-run component of base velocity. Unlike, however, the Meltzer rule and the Friedman rule before it, and much more like the Taylor rule, McCallum's rule also includes a feedback term for stabilizing nominal GDP over the cycle. So the way I would put it would be to say that the McCallum rule and the Taylor rule are similar, both in terms of their objectives and in their design, in that they attempt to achieve modest stabilization objectives over the business cycle. At the same time, they preserve longer run price stability. So again, in the paper, I go through more of the details about this arc according to which the shadow gradually gravitated away from Milton Friedman's constant money growth rule, more or less, and towards something that started to look more and more like the Taylor rule. And today, we don't have a committee consensus statement exactly on this matter, but just speaking for myself, I'd be totally happy to see the Federal Open Market Committee adopt and make consistent reference to some variant of the Taylor rule in making its decisions and describing the rationale for those decisions to the public. I think that would go a long way towards improving monetary policy here in the United States, and I would guess that most of my shadow open market colleagues would agree with me on that. Now, before I wrap up, though, I do want to go back one last time to the original quantity theoretic framework espoused by Brunner, Meltzer, and other early committee members, and just ask, can we find any value today, enduring value, to such an approach to monetary policy analysis and evaluation? Most economists these days, I would guess, would say no right off the bat for the simple reason that the monetary base grew by a factor of 4 during and after the financial crisis and Great Recession of 2008, 2009, without generating anything remotely like that in terms of an increase in the aggregate nominal price level. My counterpoint will be, though, that if you begin to take even an ever so slightly closer look at the data, you can see that maybe there's more to it than that. So in order to do this, here on this next slide, I'm plotting the same underlying series, the growth rate of the monetary base, but in two different ways. Over on the left, monthly percentage changes in order to highlight two very brief episodes of extraordinary growth in the monetary base, one in 2008, second in 2020. Over on the right-hand side, year-over-year percentage changes to highlight better intermediate term trends. And the first thing I want to call your attention to over on the left is that during the 2008-2009 episode, by far and away, the biggest percentage point changes in the monetary base occurred in a very narrow window of time, early fall 2008, before zero interest rates and before QE1. Instead, these increases in the base were driven by emergency lending at the height of the financial crisis. Now, this is difficult to remember today in light of everything that's happened since. But if you go back to mid-2008, so spring, summer, even into the early fall, the biggest macroeconomic concern, as opposed to banking and financial market concern on the Federal Open Market Committee in those days, actually had to do with the threat of higher, not lower rates of inflation. Those were the days when every time you drove by the local gas station, right, the price of a gallon of gas had reached a new and more astonishing peak. And the concern was that increases in oil prices were going to pass through and work to increase broader base measures of inflation. So the Federal Reserve had to conduct emergency lending, and that in turn necessitated large increases in base money. But FOMC members did not want those increases in the monetary base to translate into higher rates of inflation. That was the rationale behind paying interest on reserves in the first place. Now, it is true that the monetary base continued to increase because of QEs 1 through 3. But first of all, in terms of percentage point changes as opposed to absolute dollar amounts, those changes were somewhat smaller, if only because the monetary base had already increased by so much. What's more, those changes occurred over a period of many years, and some of them were eventually reversed by quantitative tightening. So if you just calculate the average annual growth rate of the monetary base over the decade-long period beginning in January 2009, it works out to be only about 7% per year, on the high side by historical standards, but certainly not hyperinflationary. Another way of seeing this is to take a look at the growth rate of M2 plotted in the same two ways on this next slide, and observe that QE1 through QE3 never generated a persistent acceleration in M2 growth. Okay. On the other hand, the second big burst in the monetary base in 2020 was accompanied by a surge in M2 growth and was followed by higher unwanted inflation. Okay, but look, you don't have to take my word for it. Go back to Friedman and Schwartz and remember a key element of the Friedman-Schwartz's story is that to see the deflationary impulses sent through the American economy by contractionary monetary policy during the Depression, you can't just look at the monetary base. You have to look at M2 as well. That's where the enormous monetary contraction is so readily visible. I'd also call your attention to a very nice recent paper by Samuel Renard from last year's volume of Economics Letters, in which Samuel takes a look at a number of historical episodes in the United States and other countries as well, of large-scale central bank balance sheet expansion, and shows that those episodes were followed by higher inflation, but only in those cases where broad money growth accelerated as well. Okay, so far from being obsolete or completely useless, it strikes me that a quantity theoretic framework like that espoused by Brunner, Meltzer, and early shadow open market committee members would have served very usefully as a cross-check against everything that the FOMC has actually done over the past 15 to 20 years. In particular, sluggish M2 growth in the aftermath of 2008, 2009 confirms that despite everything, years of zero interest rates, wave after wave of quantitative easing, monetary policy was never over expansionary during that episode. But again, on the other hand, the surge in M2 growth in 2021 gave early warning that the Fed was overdoing it. That was a major monetary policy mistake that might have been avoided, at least in part, had somebody on the FOMC been thinking about Brunner, Meltzer, and the other early SOMC members. Thanks.
I'm going to focus on the importance of rules versus discretion, and I'm also going to try to make relevant the continued importance of monetary control for the preservation of price stability. And the subtext in this is going to be that the FOMC's use of the language of discretion obscures the nature of the monetary standard and makes it fragile. Okay, so in its public communication, press conferences, speeches, and so on, the FOMC emphasizes the importance of discretion, that is, flexibility. And it seems to make sense. Well, you don't know, you can't really forecast the economy. You don't know what the big problem is going to be. So you watch the economy evolve. And if the major problem is with maximum employment, well, you lower the funds rate. But if the major problem is with price stability, you raise the funds rate. Seems to make perfect sense. But it does raise some questions. First of all, as a student of Milton Friedman, I'm thinking, well, if you really are making these decisions period by period, by looking out the window at the economy, what about the long and variable lags critique? Was that never relevant? And I'm going to rephrase that question. And the way I'm going to rephrase it is, in order for monetary policy to be stabilizing, the FOMC has to solve the simultaneous, the identification problem, the problem of simultaneity. That is, FOMC behavior affects the economy, and the behavior of the economy affects the FOMC. And so if monetary policy is going to be stabilizing, the FOMC has to sort out the one-way causation. And the economists who take that seriously have a lot of problem with it. They have to use a model with the reaction function and think about how it influences expectations. We don't hear any of that from the FOMC. So how does the FOMC deal with these problems, in particular the identification problem? All right, so if you think about it, I mean, we don't have a command and control economy. We have to, if we're going to hit our targets of maximum employment and price stability, somehow monetary policy has to transmit to the collective behavior of an innumerable number of households and firms, and it's got to organize it. Well, if you think about that, that's got to happen through the price system and the way the consistency in policy influences expectations. So how does the FOMC square this reality with this language of discretion? And I argue that the FOMC communicates on two tracks. The one track is to the public, and it sort of communicates the message that, yeah, we manage the economy, don't mess with our independence, or you'll limit our ability to stabilize the economy. But the markets understand the consistency of policy. And what I'm going to do in the rest of my talk is I'm going to try to make that last comment concrete and real. Okay, so since the 1951 Accord, there's been a baseline monetary policy. Okay, and that baseline monetary policy was called Leaning Against the Wind by William McChesney Martin. And the essence of it is that the Fed watches the rate of growth of the economy, and through observing the rate of resource utilization in the economy, makes a decision about whether the economy is growing unsustainably fast or unsustainably slow. And then it responds in a common sense way to stabilize the rate of the economy's rate of resource utilization. Okay, now that's the baseline policy, but it occurs in two variants. And you, if you're interested, you can read the details in my book. Okay, excuse the shameless self-promotion. Had to do that. All right. So one variant I call leaning against the wind with credibility. It could also be called leaning against the wind with preemptive moves in the funds rate to preserve price stability so inflation doesn't emerge. The other variant I call lean against the wind with trade-offs, where you have the focus is not just on preserving price stability, but the focus is on trading off between two independent targets of low inflation and low unemployment. It's got to use a Phillips curve. And with this variant, when the economy begins to grow strongly, rather than preemptive changes in the funds rate, you don't see these significant changes until inflation actually emerges. And then you see these significant increases in the funds rate. Okay, I'm going to concentrate on the first one. I call it law, leaning against the wind with preemptive increases in the funds rate to preserve inflation. And so a point I want to emphasize is that with this rule, the FOMC is stabilizing the economy's rate of resource utilization. It's not attempting to control real output, the behavior of real variables, output, and employment emerge as a consequence of the operation of the price system. Okay, as opposed to the other variant. Okay, and that's going to be important. So let's take an example to try to make it concrete. Let's assume that as information comes in on the behavior of the economy, it becomes clear that the economy is growing too fast. Okay, well, the FOMC is going to raise the funds rate. Now, if you think about it, well, okay, the funds rate, the real rate of interest is below the natural rate of interest. So let's estimate what the natural rate of interest is and move the funds rate up. And maybe you move it up 3/4 of a percentage point or 1.5 percentage points. Well, that's not the way it works. The FOMC typically starts with 1/4 of a percentage point, or if it feels it's behind the curve, 0.5 percentage point. Okay, but the transmission of monetary policy occurs through the yield curve, but the yield curve is not constrained in that way. Just because the funds rate is moved up by 1/4 of a percentage point, that doesn't mean the yield curve is going to move up by 1/4 of a percentage point. So what shapes, anchors, stabilizes makes the behavior of the yield curve stabilizing? Well, participants in financial markets, and especially the individuals trying to arbitrage forward rates, they understand that the bottom line, that the North Star is going to be returning the economy to a level in which the rate of resource utilization is stable. Okay, and so immediately the yield curve is going to move in such a way that markets feel like they're making their best guess of what the future path of interest rates is going to be to achieve that objective. Okay, and the point I want to make here is that the yield curve adjusts continuously as new information comes in, not just once an FOMC meeting. So that there's a continual adjustment of the yield curve, and the effect of that is that the yield curve stays fairly close to the natural rate of interest. That is, the natural rate of interest being the real rate of interest that distributes aggregate demand intertemporally to keep contemporaneous aggregate demand equal to potential output. And it's that tracking of the natural rate of interest by the yield curve through this continuous adjustment that avoids the Friedman long and variable lag critiques. So you don't get this big discrepancy between the real rate of interest and the natural rate of interest. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what I think this is important, and it relates to the kinds of things that goes back to the founding of the FOMC, and my comments that price stability requires monetary control. So we've gotten away from that, and let's first of all ask why we've gotten away from that. Well, let's talk about M1. So in the early 1980s, what happened is that computers reduced the cost of switching funds, money, out of the money market and bank deposits. And when market interest rates change, banks lag in the rate at which they change the interest rates on their deposits. So let's say the economy weakens, interest rates in the money markets decline, but the rates on bank deposits still look pretty good. So there's a transfer of funds out of money market instruments, which are relatively illiquid, into bank deposits. And so the composition of M1 between instruments that are relatively illiquid and savings instruments and instruments that are relatively liquid, transactions deposits, that composition changes. So even though M1 growth rises, liquidity doesn't. What you really care about is the liquidity in the public's asset portfolio doesn't change. And so the result was that the behavior of M1 became counter-cyclical instead of pro-cyclical, and stopped offering useful information for monetary policy. Okay, that was M1. We can talk about division and so on. Okay, but still, so how do you talk about monetary control? Well, in terms of this rule implemented by leaning against the wind with credibility, it comes in, there's two aspects to the rule. You need credibility to maintain the expectation of price stability, and then you need this leaning against the wind rule that causes the real rate of interest to track the natural rate of interest and maintain equilibrium in the goods and services market. Okay, so when you think about monetary control, then you've got these two aspects. First of all, with that credibility, the public is going to demand an amount of money consistent with the assumption of price stability. And given that the stabilization in the economy's rate of resource utilization allows market forces to cause the real output to grow along potential, then with real output growing along potential, money demand will increase in line. So you discipline the demand for money in these two ways, through the credibility of a rule and through preventing excesses in the goods and services market and keeping output growth at potential. And with an interest rate target, then the banks accommodate that increased demand, which is consistent with price stability. And with its interest rate peg, the Fed accommodates the associated increase in reserves. So these procedures provide for monetary control, even though the FOMC may not even follow money, and certainly doesn't have procedures for controlling money. So thank you.
Excellent. Turn it over to Greg, who's going to clean it up for us before we turn to Q&A.
I recognize that I'm between you, some questions, and lunch. So I recognize my the tender spot I'm in, like the Federal Reserve is on most days. It is, since the session is on the nominal anchor, I just thought it would be useful to remind ourselves what we actually mean by the nominal anchor and whether or not there has been some drift in our understanding of what indeed establishes a nominal anchor and what a nominal anchor is. So I tried to delineate the entire conversation into 5 important questions. And I think it's useful when you walk away from a seminar to know that you've learned something. I know and I believe you will learn at least one thing of those 5 today, hopefully all 5. The first is, who first established the nominal anchor concept and why? Second is, what is the nominal anchor's original meaning by that author? What does the Federal Reserve have a nominal anchor, and is the Fed's use of the concept of the nominal anchor the same as the original? Finally, did the Fed's nominal anchor go wobbly in the post-pandemic era? Let's begin. Anybody know who came up with the term? And probably nobody read the paper yet. That's okay. But it's actually surprising. And I'll tell you, I had it double checked with Ed Nelson, who I separately asked him, can you tell me who you think came up with the first use of the term nominal anchor? We came up with the same name and the same paper. And it happens to be a paper by Robert Barrow in the Economic Journal in 1979. And it has to be understood in the context of the post-gold standard Great Inflation time period, which is when he wrote about. And there are citations around the early 80s that suggest that indeed Robert Barrow had put the word nominal in front of anchors. Other people would use the word anchor, but nominal anchor in terms of what appears in the literature first appears in this EJ article. And I will go to it right now. The important thing for him, and this actually talks a bit on some of what Kevin said, he imagined this idealized world where international finance, monetary policy all works perfectly. It is based on the gold standard where the central bank supports the nominal price of a reserve commodity. And that, in fact, determines the price level, because once you've got the relative price of gold to money and you have the amount of gold, then you can figure out the amount of money. Once you figure out the price, how much money you got, in most models, the price level. But more importantly, there's actually, and the key word at the bottom there is the word system. The system possesses a nominal anchor because internal to the gold standard, to the gold standard's nominal anchor is a system that actually determines the amount of money that indeed pins down the amount that pins down the price level. And this is just continuing that article. By way of contrast, the absolute price level is determinant only up to the determination of the quantity of the fiat currency. And because there is no theory of who and what the behavior of this monetary fiat currency can do, his belief was there is no obvious nominal anchor that prescribes some likely limits to changes in the absolute price level. In fact, he thinks about issues of whether or not we should have a monetary constitution. There's no monetary rule at the time. Whoever determines the amount of money gets to determine the price level. There's nothing internal systematically consistent with constraining the amount of money in a fiat money system. And because of that, the absolute price level does not have a nominal anchor. What he is looking for, much like in the gold standard, is automaticity, which you can think of as the word systematic, and consequently absence of political control. If we fast forward just 2 years to a paper that Robert Barrow published in an NBR volume edited by Bob Hall on inflation, a book on inflation, he actually says that basically it is clear that the nominal anchor for the monetary system, weak as it was earlier, is now entirely absent. And if you go further down, he uses a word that he will use again in some key papers with David Gordon, that future monetary growth and long-run inflation appear now to depend entirely on the year-to-year discretion of the monetary authority, that is, the Federal Reserve. That is the origin of nominal anchor, everyone. Here are some takeaways. So you did learn one thing, all right? You owe me. All right, so Barrow's search for a nominal anchor has to be understood within this period of the gold standard, which was a self-contained system that determined, not only that only provided a nominal anchor, but also provided a constraint on monetary on money that did indeed tie down the long-run price level. This is a system, and that has to be completely understood. Otherwise, a nominal anchor without an effective system, which you can think of as a policy chain, an anchor without a chain is just a hunk of metal lying on the ocean floor. That's it, everyone. The nominal anchor doesn't work if there's not an effective policy chain connecting it to the ultimate price level that we are trying to stabilize. So the next question is, does the Federal Reserve have a nominal anchor? And it turns out that and this I have to thank Andrew Levin, who told me it's actually on the Fed's website. And you can actually go and Google, what is the Fed's nominal anchor? Ready for everybody? That's it, 2%. It's the long run goal. That is an explicit objective. And you can see that it has a lot of the same words that Professor Barrow was emphasizing in his understanding of how to think about a nominal anchor. There's lots of words like policy, strategy, and systematic, but it's used in somewhat different way. You'll see one of the key underlying words at the bottom is that it's not a systematic policy that drives it. It's not automaticity that drives it. It's actually a flexible and adaptive strategy, which sounds a little fuzzy, everyone, but it does plan to systematically return inflation to 2% over time. So there is these definitions are what I'll call cousins, reasonably close cousins, but they are not the same thing. That is the next question. Does the Fed's use of the concept differ from the original? The original, once again, a nominal variable that can deliver price stability with effective constraints to make policy systematic and eliminate discretion. The Fed's nominal anchor is the empirical understanding of price stability. Probably not the worst idea in the world, a decent idea. The policy strategy is flexible. Probably I'll insert, the kind of commonly used term data dependent, but systematically returns inflation to the nominal anchor. These are not quite the same thing. That doesn't mean that the Fed system does not form an effective chain, but maybe history will inform us whether it has or it has not. That is the final part and the final question that we're going to get to. Oh my God, there are lines everywhere. I tried to squeeze it in on one page. Let's see how this works. Let's at least look at the red line. That is the rate of inflation. It has a scale on the right-hand side. That is the variable, and this is defined over the period 2014 through, I think it is, through 2012 to current time period. This is the time period over which the Federal Reserve has had that 2% anchor. So I just focused the attention just on that time period. You can see that inflation, as measured on the right-hand side, was under 2% off and on throughout the pre-pandemic inflation recession, before the pre-pandemic recession. But of course, starting in about 2021, the rate of inflation rose dramatically. So that's kind of the big piece of it. And during this time period, of course, there was a lot of instability in inflation, a lot of great concern about whether or not the Fed's nominal anchor was strong or whether it had gone wobbly. And people can look at expectations and do a whole bunch of different things. But there are two things that were pointed out already by Axel today, which give me reason to believe that the nominal anchor did go wobbly during this time period. First one is the forward guidance trap. This is also emphasized in some great work by my SOMC colleague and dear friend, Athanasios. And that is that the Fed, made additional constraints to the conduct of both its interest rate policy in terms of using outcomes-based rather than policy-based forecast determinations of policy, and also with regards to its portfolio, its balance sheet operations that were kind of pre-committed to not increase interest rates until the purchases of treasuries had gone to zero. And if you think about what Robert Barrow emphasized, what Robert Barrow emphasized is that you had to have a nominal anchor that provided appropriate constraints on monetary policy. And in this case, in terms of the forward guidance issues, it added additional constraints that were perhaps not helpful in obtaining price stability. So it's not that the Fed put on the wrong constraints, it just put on additional constraints that prohibited it from adopting and obtaining price stability. What happened is because of these additional constraints, it delayed the ability to raise interest rates and try to slow down the rate of inflation that had grown so dramatically in the period of 2021. And that's what I call it the great delay. These additional constraints slowed down the Federal Reserve's ability to combat the rise of inflation in a timely way. They got behind. It was because of the great delay. One of my views is that every great macro episode has the same first name, which is great. So the second word, you just have to fill in for yourself. The first piece is the great delay. The second one, of course, the second kind of error that, if you think about what Robert Barrow suggested in thinking about the nominal anchor, which is to try to make it systematic, to make your policy systematic and automatic. And the second is that you eliminate discretion. But of course, the transitory inflation call is about as discretionary as it gets. We always think about the distinction between transitory and persistent, or transitory and permanent, as a statistical inference. And very seldomly do you get evidence that a rise of inflation is 100% transitory and worth, walking past or hoping goes away. Figure 1, as I showed before, shows that there's an incredible increase in M2, which has been pointed out by about half the readers so far, half the speakers so far. And what we see is that indeed the Fed did get behind, that the inflation surged, nominal income was rising, the Fed's inability to raise interest rates during that time period, both because of the delay, but also its determination that inflation was not an immediate problem, is the second part I refer to as the great denial. Concluding thoughts, everyone, and that will hopefully get us back almost on time. Concluding thoughts. The nominal anchor is appropriately thought of as a system must be capable of delivering long-run price stability and constrained monetary policy to be systematic and discretion-free. This is the definition we get from the original article. This is the original understanding we get from Robert Barrow's initial article. The forward guidance trap reveals that the Fed placed too many inappropriate constraints on monetary policy to deliver its price stability mandate. The transitory inflation call reveals the Fed had not sufficiently constrained discretion from its decision-making to deliver the price stability goal. Descendants of John Taylor's rules would have helped. Not any rule, as Jim demonstrated, a dovish rule might have even suggested that things could have been moved much earlier. the advice of Marvin Goodfriend, another former SOMC colleague wrote a paper in the early 90s that suggested that even inflation scares need to be addressed in real time. A sturdier nominal anchor for the Fed should be a key topic for discussion as it reviews its longer run goals and monetary policy strategy. And applying appropriate constraints and systematic and discretion-free policy should be established both for interest rate determination and balance sheet determination. And advocates for these constraints need to be at the table when those discussions are had. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Greg. We've got time for a few questions before Chris leads us at lunch at noon. Let me call on folks. I see Andy over here. Can we pass a microphone in the front?
Great session. So I just want to make sure we get the history precise. So so I just want to think back to March 2022, okay? Because I think that part of it is what Altansio's described, and part of it is team transitory, but that wasn't all there was. Okay, so March 2022, the Fed hikes, how much? A quarter point. I just want to read you the statement here. Okay, voting for, there was a bunch of names. Voting against this action was Jim Bullard, actually it says James Bullard, sorry, who preferred at this meeting to raise the target rate by 0.5 percentage point. Okay, so the very first move they made wasn't we're really behind the curve here. Okay, the other thing that's important to remember is there was a whole long period of, we're just moving back toward neutral. And so at the March 22 meeting, this is connected exactly to what Bob Hetzel was talking about. At the March 2022 meeting, they released fresh projections. Their projection was that at the end of the year, the federal funds rate would be 1.9%. And that it was going to peak at 2.5% and then come back down a little bit. And you must remember all this, all of you, right? How many press conferences there were where the Fed chair was talking about, well, we just need to move back to neutral and that'll take care of the problem. I just want to ask Kevin, since you're the chair of this, what can be constructive to help the Fed combat the problem of groupthink? Because it seems to me that's the deeper problem underneath all of these other problems, the problem of groupthink.
So it's a good question. I'll try to give a brief answer. One is there has to be a genuine openness intellectually to ideas that would otherwise be thought heretical. Money is an idea that had fallen so far out of favor that any discussion around the table about M2 growth, I suspect, would have been met by people that would sort of look aside. I think that that's a period of another error. So if you are justifiably humble, not just rhetorically humble, but justifiably humble about your forecasting ability, about the quality of Furbus to be able to plot the future, if you aren't sure about the causes and consequences of inflation, you have to encourage people that might have views that are quite out of favor to step up. So I'd say that's one. Two, there has to be an understanding that the more we give in forward guidance, the more that we are subject to human nature. The more we tell everybody what we're going to do for our dots in the next several meetings of the next year, what we all tend to do is we don't want to be proven wrong. So we crowd out ideas that might be against the forecasts we gave. I think generally that the long tradition that started around the time that I departed the Fed, that we be hugely transparent, as if that is an unvarnished good with our forecasts for the future, our number of interest rates, has proven to slow the reaction function by policymakers to changes that would otherwise prove their forecasts to be wrong. I think the most important parts of forward guidance is to say what your reaction function will be to different events. But the moment that you give your forecasts, we all tend to lock ourselves into those. We tend to be resistant to change. We tend to herd in our behavior. And Andy, as you know, it's one terrible negative consequence of the last decade over these forecasts is they're all largely the same. the growth forecast, inflation forecast from the staff happen to mirror very similarly the forecast from the other 19 participants around the table. Who wants to break from the center? Who wants to do that? In which case, when you're wrong, you're horribly wrong. Don Cohn and I'll say this as a final point. Don and I used to have a lot of family fights when we were at the Fed back in the day, but we had family fights. And in some sense, the fight we had then, which I would say is relevant now, is it the job of the FOMC to minimize deviations in output and employment from what we state? Or is it the job of the FOMC to minimize very significant deviations in output and employment? Are we really effectively in the fine-tuning business because we have such great knowledge of these real and nominal variables? Or are we in the business of avoiding very big mistakes? And I guess I'd summarize this, Andy, by saying the forward guidance we give, the process of speaking everybody so frequently about their dots and forecasts tends to exacerbate the risks that when you make a mistake, it'll be a doozy.
One problem is that people are human and the stakes are so high. You just can't say, oh, I screwed up. I caused the Great Recession. Why did Ben Bernanke write a paper in the AER where he only talks about credit policy? He never talks about monetary policy. Well, so that makes it very hard to learn because the Fed just rationalizes whatever it's done. Right or wrong. And then it goes, oh yeah, the economy's evolving. We don't really have a good way of learning. So if you had a rule, then that would force you to move away from rationalizing what you did, but actually defend what you did in terms of that rule. And that would be a lot harder.
Okay, great. Let's turn to other questions. John, right behind you.
This is great. Thank you. I do sort of feel like I went to a memorial service for a friend who died in 1982, and where the eulogy starts with, wait, someone's screaming in the casket. Maybe he isn't dead after all. I have a narrow question for Peter and then the larger question for the rest of you. So Peter, right, the casket, the moan from the casket is that M2 went up before the recent inflation. And Peter pointed to M2 growth as this return of monetarism. But the problem with M2 is that the Fed does not control M2. And for the quantity of money to control the price level, the Fed must control the supply of money. There are no reserve requirements. The interest rate on money is either zero or equal to the interest rate on bonds. We're in a perpetual liquidity trap. So this seems pretty obvious that this is a case where the price level determines M2, not M2 determines the price level, because it's completely endogenous. And that leads to my larger question. We kind of danced around what is this nominal anchor anyway. I sense two definitions. One is what is in the Fed's procedures to make it kind of pay attention to inflation a little better. But the other, and the one that Barrow, thanks very much for the Barrow, had in mind, it's a property of an economic model. What is the key ingredient of an economic model that allows that model to determine the price level? And we got a problem, guys. The Fed is not controlling the money supply. So even if that did, in principle, determine the price level, we're not doing it. We do not have a gold standard. That, in principle, could work. We're not doing it. Even if the Fed determined the money supply, when velocity is interest elastic, there are multiple equilibrium. That doesn't determine the price level. Interest rate targets lead multiple equilibria. That doesn't determine the price level. Our Fed does not engage in off-equilibrium threats to kill the economy to deliver multiple equilibria. That doesn't determine the price level. As you know, I think there's only one answer remaining, but I'm curious what your view is of the subject of this question, at least the economic one. What determines the price level?
Peter, in the interest of time, maybe you answer the M2 question, and the other sounds like the next meeting of the SOMC.
Right. Two quick answers to the question. I mean, one is there any information content? Monetarist analysis has almost always been reduced form. Okay, and this is reduced form evidence. And you ask, does that reduced form evidence provide any signal for whether monetary policy conducted not in an attempt to target M2, but holding interest rates at zero while you're conducting quantitative easing? Okay, is it inappropriately overly accommodative? Okay, now you're right. Velocity moves around. I mean, I admitted as much. If your narrow definition of monetarism is, we follow a constant money growth rule. My point was that was, that's dead, and rightly so. I still think that there's a legitimate question of what you glean from information about M2 against the backdrop of tremendous uncertainty about whether the Fed was overdoing it or whether to pull back would risk falling back into a terrible recession. The second answer to the question would be, okay, just because the Fed Reserve has a monetary system where it cannot control M2, one could conceive of a monetary policy system where it could exercise more control over M2. And the question then would be, would that be better or worse than what we have right now? It's important to remember that Milton Friedman never argued that the constant money growth rule would be like the optimal policy in any kind of DSG model. What he argued was a monetary policy dedicated to holding M2 growth constant would have been better than what we experienced during the Great Depression and better than what we experienced during the 1970s. It so happens I still agree with that. And then you ask, well, the cry out in the coffin. I mean, the thing is, are we happy with what happened in 2020? Do we want to, as Kevin said, just, well, that happened, but now we're back to 2% inflation, or sort of, let's just, move on. I think a lot of people, that's what they want. It's not really what I want.
Great. We have time for one final question. I saw a hand over here.
So I wanted to praise Greg Hess's archaeological work. I remember Barrow giving a version of that paper and some related seminars at Rochester. And I think it's very important to recognize that what he was talking about was determining the price level. The current system we have in the United States of an inflation target, taken narrowly, does not determine the price level. It determines a rate of change of the price level. And Barrow was actually very interested in what the behavior of the price level would be under a constant money growth rule, because it was a period in which the U.S. was looking forward, optimistically, to a disinflation. A disinflation would cut the nominal interest rate, increase the real demand for money, and potentially cause havoc with analysis based on constant money growth rule. Now, the final observation I'd make, given that that's ancient history, is to look at the recent years. I think there's significant evidence that during the recent period, some measures of market expectations for long-term inflation have gone up, not hugely, but 1%. And some other shorter term measures of inflation have gone up, expected inflation have gone up much more. Now, that's understandable if the world's partly transitory and partly permanent. And what seems a success for the Powell Fed so far is that they've gotten those longer term numbers to come down. And yet it also suggests that there was some significant uncertainty in the public mind about that inflation targeting system.
Greg, with that praise, you're allowed the final word, and then we're going to call it.
Thank you. Let's have lunch.
Guys, thank you.